One of our current major economic problems is inequality. So far on the channel, we've spent the last several videos describing this problem. Now, I think it's time to start talking about solutions. Taxing the rich is arguably the most popular solution proposed to solve the problem of inequality. That's too bad, because I don't think it's going to work. Today, I'd like to try and convince you of three things. Taxing the rich will not solve inequality. We will inevitably do it anyways, wasting effort in the process. And finally, there is a much better solution available to us. Why taxing the rich will not solve inequality? There are several reasons why taxing the rich won't solve inequality. First, let's define what I mean by inequality. By inequality, I mean extreme concentration of wealth, i.e. assets, in the hands of a very small percentage of the population. This is made manifest quantifiably as a Gini coefficient of over 0.8 in the United States for wealth concentration. If you're unfamiliar, a Gini coefficient is a very simple way to express equality. It's just a scale between 0 and 1. 0 represents perfect equality, meaning everyone has the exact same wealth as each other, whereas 1 represents perfect inequality, meaning one person controls all the wealth and everyone else has none. A simple example of this would be if there was $100 of wealth and 10 people dividing that wealth amongst themselves. If all 10 people each had $10, you'd have a perfectly equal society, so the Gini coefficient would be 0. On the other hand, if one person had $100 while everyone else had nothing, you'd have a perfectly unequal society, so the Gini would be 1. So, if the United States has a Gini of over 0.8, the society has extreme inequality in terms of wealth. This is an objective fact. Now, coupled with this fact is the phenomenon of Thomas Piketty's R greater than G, whereby the growth rate of capital is higher than that of wages, which means the tendency is for inequality to naturally get worse over the long run in an exponential fashion. Then, because this is all true, it seems intuitive that the best way to fix all of this is to redistribute wealth. Simply tax more from those at the very top who can easily afford to pay more and use it to fund public goods for the average person. Unfortunately, I don't think this is going to work, and it's very easy to understand why. The math does not math. Most realistic tax proposals do not raise anywhere near enough money to meaningfully shift the balance of inequality in society. With how passionate people are about taxing the rich, I was kind of surprised to see that no one seemed to bother to actually calculate how much money you could raise. In my mind, there's two very elementary questions you'd want to start with, which is A, how much money can we raise? And B, what can we fund with this money? The loudest voices on the subject don't seem to answer these very basic starting questions. So, by my estimation, which you can find the details of in my description box or my Substack essay, we could probably raise about $100 to $300 billion per year, depending on the approach of taxation you went with. And yes, my estimation of course adjusts for factors such as relocation and tax sheltering strategies, which will certainly be used by the super wealthy to try and avoid increased taxation. Now, to the untrained eye, a couple $100 billion might sound like a lot of money. It's much more money than any normal person could possibly conceive of, right? But when we're talking about that money being used to provide services for millions and millions and millions of people, reality starts to kick in. If we took the high end of my estimate, taxing the rich would raise enough money for about 2 weeks worth of government spending. Another way to think about it is that it represents about $1,850 per household, or about $890 per person. I don't know about you, but I don't see how redistributing $890 worth of value to everyone is going to meaningfully address inequality. You might say, okay, then let's tax them even more. The problem with that is the high end of my number is already based on a very aggressive tax proposal, one that would be highly unlikely to pass. I used Elizabeth Warren's proposal to tax 2% of net worth above $50 million and 6% above $1 billion. A plan to tax even more than this is extremely unrealistic. Not only that, it would undoubtedly cause extreme strain on the relationship between the state and private businesses, provoking a reaction that exceeds the present strain between the state and working class. So the bottom line here is that inequality is a direct cause of the divide between those who own assets and those who do not. Taxing the super rich does not shift any meaningful amount of asset ownership to the average person. Therefore, it does not address the root cause of inequality at all. It will not make asset prices go down because billionaires are forced to sell. This is an incorrect assumption. Billionaires already sell assets all the time, and it does not cause meaningful drops in values. Forcing them to sell a few percentage points of net worth will not either. Liquid markets absorb this no problem. You will not be able to buy cheap assets. It will not allow you to reduce taxes on the average person meaningfully. This is also an incorrect assumption. $1,850 of new value for households is not nothing, but it's also not enough to radically alter the fabric of society, even to a moderate degree. So by just taking the steps of doing some rudimentary back of the napkin math, we can see that taxing the rich largely amounts to political theater. There is an incredible amount of passion and effort put towards this idea that sounds great at first, but it's just not going to deliver the advertised results. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe that many of the proponents of taxing the rich have genuinely good intentions, and they also have correctly diagnosed the problem of inequality. It's just that their plan to treat it is very misguided, in my view. I'm open to being wrong on this, and I'm happy to consider arguments that show how it can meaningfully address inequality. But for now, I remain unconvinced. The money realistically available to be raised is just not that meaningful in the grand scheme, especially given the political cost to obtain it. Now, with all that being said, for those of you who are unfamiliar with my work, I want to make something really clear to you. I want to reduce inequality. I'm not arguing against the idea of taxing the rich because I have money or that I'm a conservative or ideologically opposed to people who do want to tax the rich. I actually don't subscribe to any political teams, nor am I married to any specific ideologies. I'm just trying to figure out how to navigate the future and the present moment while doing my best to think critically about it. I understand the sentiment behind the desire to tax the rich just as well as anyone. I've dedicated a great deal of time and effort to documenting the divide between rich and poor in my last several videos. And I've basically dedicated my life over the last several years to rebelling against the dominance hierarchy in place above us that forces us to be economically dependent, powerless individuals. I believe that a critical reading of history reveals that there are only truly two classes of people, the working class and the elite classes. These two classes have always existed throughout human civilization since we stopped hunting and gathering. The middle class, on the other hand, has not existed except for brief illusory periods, and this latest illusory period is ending right now. So the diagnosis is correct. The divide between 99.9% of humanity and 0.1% is problematic and always has been. But we have to be careful about what path we choose to address this. Okay, so this is going to bring me to my second claim. Taxing the rich is not going to work, but we're going to do it anyways. Back of the napkin math shows how taxing the rich is not very effective. But yes, my second claim is that we are going to do it anyways, probably within a decade. Why? I think it's because an ancient Greek man by the name of Polybius said so. Polybius was a historian writing around 200 to 100 BC, and he created what is, in my opinion, one of the most accurate forecasts for the cyclical behavior of governments. I'm going to put the image of the cycle on the screen, but for those of you just listening, it's no problem. I'm going to describe it as well. Basically, the cycle goes as follows. There's 3 main stages of government: rule by one, rule by a group, and rule by everyone. Each stage has a virtuous phase and a corrupted phase. So let's start with rule by one, meaning a single person rules the entire government themselves. The virtuous phase of this cycle, Polybius calls monarchy, a single virtuous ruler. But in his view, monarchy always degenerates into tyranny, a single corrupted ruler, as eventually a single ruler always becomes despotic. Seeking to overthrow the tyrant, a small group of powerful individuals attempt to save society on behalf of the people. This then moves us into the next stage, which is aristocracy, which is ruled by a small virtuous group. But again, this form of rule degenerates. The group becomes self-interested, and it turns into an oligarchy, which is ruled by a small corrupted group. Now, for a second time, the people rebel against this, but this time they decide to take power for themselves collectively, seeking to right the wrongs of the oligarchy. This gives rise to democracy, the stage of virtuous rule by the many. Unfortunately, though, democracy is not the end of history. Democracy gives rise to populism, which in turn creates demagogues who feed off fears, prejudice, and emotions. The demagogues in turn give rise to ochlocracy, the complete degeneration of the rule by many, where mobs rule. But this is also not the end, because remember, for Polybius, this was a cycle. Eventually, the rule by mobs becomes too much for the people to bear. They become willing to give up their freedom in exchange for security. They yearn for order again. So the conditions are ripe for a monarch, a single virtuous ruler, to emerge and save the people. Things have become so bad that the people are willing to let a single person unilaterally govern. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan emerges once again. And the cycle just keeps playing out like that. We try one ruler, the position degenerates. We try a small group as rulers, the position degenerates. We try everyone as rulers, and the position again degenerates. It's pretty easy to understand how and why this cycle works. I mean, it's just simply human nature, right? People repeatedly try to save society at various stages from itself, and they may very well do so with good, virtuous intentions. But the position of power eventually always corrupts. The ring of power always wins. I think this is a very Lindy world model. It's also pretty easy to identify, looking at this, where we would be in this world model right now. I mean, we're clearly at the populism stage, right? The point at which democracy is degenerating into demagoguery, which will likely further unravel into ochlocracy, mob rule, which may then give birth to a monarchy again, or techno-monarchy, I should say, but that's a conversation for another day. For now, the reason I bring this whole thing up is because taxing the rich is the exact type of initiative that emerges during populism. It predictably manifests just as mushrooms do given the conditions of autumn. It's perfect fuel for demagogues to take advantage of. Initiatives that emerge during populism are ones that sound intuitively right, but are actually quite ineffective in reality. They appeal to people's emotions and appear to actually genuinely be listening to them. And especially, they also take aim at another group of people, mark them as enemies, and metaphorically or literally go to war against them. But really, these initiatives only serve to further embolden demagogues and the mobs who will rise up after them. I mean, Polybius was just kind of Lindy Maxed on this. I mean, the man was pretty prescient. All of this is to say that the response to what takes place over the next few years of the Trump presidency is very likely to result in some kind of increased taxation on the rich, right? When the pendulum swings in the other direction. Whenever, or I suppose if, the Democrats get their next turn. Again, just as mushrooms grow in autumn, these types of initiatives naturally spring about in the minds and hearts of humans, given the current climate of our political economy. So, whether you want it or not, if a left-wing party wins, this is likely coming. The price of gold and other bearer assets like Bitcoin are already preparing for this as we speak. Now, I think there is a much better solution than all this. I think it is unlikely that Polybius' cycle can be stopped. Just as heaven and earth move regardless of me, so will the Leviathan of humanity. So what I'm about to say may be in vain, but like Cassandra, I still feel compelled to try. There is a much better solution to taxing the rich, one that will actually work, and one that does not require antagonizing anyone and further feeding populism's gaping maw. This solution is to finally acknowledge and come to terms with the objective fact that modern monetary theory accurately describes the way government finances work. Because MMT is the way government finances work, it means that there is no need to tax the rich to fund anything. We can simply fund massive public goods right now. You could set $1 trillion aside tomorrow to increasing the supply of major bottlenecks in our economy, such as housing, healthcare workers and equipment capacity, early childhood educators and teachers in general, energy, natural resource production, all of this. MMT is not crazy, it is not quackery, it is not progressive propaganda, it is nothing other than objectively how government finances work. So let's acknowledge reality and maybe start using it aggressively. According to MMT, taxes are not revenue and they are not required for the government to spend money. The government can spend any amount of money it wants at any time because they issue the currency. They are the sovereign. In fact, they already do this. Governments already run permanent deficits. They already create money out of thin air to fund anything they want, regardless of how much money they tax. Taxation serves a completely different purpose, which is destroying money. We don't need to get into the weeds of that right now. You can look more into that on your own time if you want, and I would recommend it. But if you don't know what modern monetary theory is, or you're of the mind that it just sounds really crazy, I would recommend just starting by reading a very basic introductory book like Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, which I can link down below. This is not an endorsement of her or all of her views, of course, but she does accurately describe the way government finances work. The main misconception with understanding government finances is we imagine them to be just like our own finances. For us, we have our income, our expenses, and then we have debt or savings, right? And at first glance, when we look at the government, it looks the exact same. They appear to have taxes for income, and then they spend those taxes, and at the end of the day, they usually have debt from spending more money than they take in through taxes. So all around the world, grandpas and uncles shake their heads and say something along the lines of the next generation being screwed because they're never going to pay back all of this debt. And if this were normal debt, like debt that a citizen might have, yeah, you're right, that citizen would be screwed if they can't pay back their debt. But government debt is not debt like a citizen has. Government debt, for all intents and purposes, actually does not really exist. That's because governments already pay off old debt with newly created money. They can always come up with the money to pay it. In other words, the government can always pay its debt, effectively making it not real. So don't worry, uncle or grandpa. We don't actually have to pay it back the way you think. Again, this misunderstanding arises because we as normal citizens obviously cannot do that. We cannot create our own money in our homes to then pay debt that we might have. Okay, now here's the thing. So then, and I know a lot of people are already chomping at the bit about this, but then your uncle or your grandpa is going to correctly point out, well, all of this is just going to cause inflation. I mean, look at all the inflation right now. If they just keep making new money to pay the old debt, then our dollars are going to become worthless. Intuitively, this obviously sounds correct. And this is basically where 99% of people drop out of the conversation because they are convinced MMT equals inflation. They look at COVID, they look at the COVID fiasco as a perfect example of MMT gone wrong. Probably not by coincidence, this is also the part of the conversation where you do need to start exercising some critical thinking paired with a rudimentary understanding of economics to see why MMT does not have to equal inflation, and really it should equal disinflation or deflation in smart hands. I think you can describe this pretty simply. In the most basic sense, inflation comes from demand exceeding supply, right? That's how values of anything go up. If the amount of money in the economy that is chasing goods and services exceeds the amount of goods and services available, obviously values will go up. You get inflation. Money in people's hands is demand. Goods and services available is supply. So if tomorrow the government said, like Oprah, everyone gets $1,000 added to their bank accounts, the effect would obviously be inflationary. You're increasing demand without increasing the supply of things that people would be buying. COVID was inflationary because we literally did that. Plus, the supply of the economy was constrained on top of that at the same time. This is the exact worst case recipe for bad inflation. But on the other hand, if over the next several years, the government created a phased plan to massively increase the housing supply, the effect would actually be disinflationary or even deflationary on housing and have no broader inflationary effects on the rest of the economy. That's because you're funding the increase of supply in the economy, not demand. So here's the thing. If you were to just massively tax the rich, you'd actually be doing the opposite of this. You'd be massively increasing demand in the economy, and it would very likely cause inflation, which would just screw everybody over again. That's because non-rich people have what is known as a higher marginal propensity to consume. Simply put, if you give the average person $1,000, they are very likely to spend it immediately back into the economy on basic things like food, housing, and transportation, because they're already strapped for cash. But if you gave a rich person $1,000, they are very unlikely to spend it at all. It will probably just sit in their bank account with the other many thousands and thousands of dollars. So if you taxed a bunch of money from rich people, money that's not really used for demand in the economy, and gave it to everyone else, suddenly you'd have a new influx of demand because all of this money would now be spent. Guys, the entire problem of our time is not that people need more money in their pockets. I know it seems like that, but it's really that we need more capacity of the things we are trying to buy. The prices are high because demand is already imbalanced to this capacity. There's already too much money in people's hands. I know that sounds crazy. But the truth is, we need capacity, and we can massively build capacity right now by funding it with government spending. Team Red is massively opposed to this for ideological reasons, and Team Blue is completely distracted with a different shiny object. So I don't know if anyone is left to listen, but this is pretty clearly a solution that not only would actually work, but it also avoids further descent into demagoguery. You know, this is just me musing here, but there's probably some inevitability to the use of MMT as well. If we do progress through demagoguery into autocracy and then revert back to monarchy, it probably also coincides time-wise with the singularity, and the monarch will likely control finances in a very MMT way anyways, probably managed by AI. This could all conceivably happen by the year 2050. Money will be very different by then. Definitely not a store of value, just a unit of account and a medium of exchange. The postmodern world becomes pre-modern again. How about that? But with a little bit of a techno twist. I suppose history is a linear progression of cycles, it would seem. Anyways, taxing the rich will not work. We're probably going to do it anyways, even though we should be talking about MMT instead. That is my view. I'm open to considering others. Let's see if we can figure this out.